So we're right at noon. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We're delighted to have um, all of you with us this afternoon for the second installment of Lydia Brandt's presentations on monuments on the State House grounds. And today she's going to focus on the Confederate monuments. I'm going to just do a quick introduction of Lydia and then hand over to her. So Lydia joined the faculty in the School of Visual Art and Design at the University of South Carolina in 2011. She teaches the history of architecture, American art, and theories and methods of historic preservation. She's been just an extraordinary partner for Historic Columbia since she arrived on campus in 2011. She has published research on historic preservation and 20th century American architecture in Winter, Portfolio, Antiques and Fine Art, Public Historian, and numerous other books. University of Virginia Press published her first book, First in the Homes of His Countrymen, George Washington's Mount Vernon in the American Imagination. That was published in 2016. Her next book focuses on the antebellum plantation's image in popular American visual culture. So we're excited about that. Dr. Brandt is a dedicated advocate for local history and preservation. She's authored 3 National Register of Historic Places nominations in Columbia and is one of 3 professors at USC who led the campaign for a monument to the university's first African-American professor, Richard Greener, which was erected early in 2018. Dr. Brandt holds a BA in art history from New York University, after which she earned her MA in architectural history and her PhD in art and architectural history at the University of Virginia. This Historic Columbia series is a lead up to the publication of a guidebook of South Carolina State House grounds that U of SC Press will publish next spring. Again, we are delighted to have this opportunity to bring Lydia to you via Zoom, and I'm going to hand over to her now.
I told Robin that she's the only person who can mute me. I don't allow myself to be shushed very often. Well, it's a pleasure to see y'all again and to have an opportunity to talk with you about the Confederate monuments on the State House grounds. So I look forward to your questions. There's some started right in with the tough ones last time, so I look forward to that again. So we talked last time, and I argued that monuments are the most public forms of memory. History is researched, it's supposed to be objective, based in historical evidence, but memory is much more subjective. It's always taking the past and reconfiguring it for its contemporary moment. It's about relating the past to the present, often for really specific and often political reasons. At the State House grounds, the building itself was a monument to specific memories of both the state's past and present. Built in the 1850s in the lead up to the Civil War, the building tied slavery to the nation's founding through this monument to George Washington, and therefore to its essential values moving forward. In the pediment that was planned and never executed, for example, the sculptural that was planned for the pediment and never executed, we see an argument for slavery as being something timeless, something that not only happened in the past, but continues to happen in the present, with the assumption that it'll continue into the future. And all of this put together was an argument in the 1850s leading up to South Carolina's secession, that South Carolina and every other state had sovereignty in light of the federal government. We're on our own, our independence as a state is guaranteed by the Constitution. And there's no issue that's more important there than slavery. So these are the same attitudes and beliefs that, of course, are going to lead to secession in the beginning of the Civil War. But all of that is literally baked into the building in the years leading up to secession. And it's very consciously a matter of using history to make arguments for the legitimacy of that perspective. The building was, of course, completed during Reconstruction after the Confederates had lost the Civil War. And so this building that was essentially a temple to slavery in its construction, in its first occupation, the first government to actually operate out of this building was the only Black majority state legislature in the history of the United States. I mean, that is just an incredible turnaround. Within 10 years, a building is both a temple to this idea that slavery is eternal, that it is something that is guaranteed by the Constitution, to a building that is home to a biracial legislature, where Black men work alongside white men as equals in citizenship and politics. So after Reconstruction, the ending of Reconstruction by a group that saw themselves as redeemers, taking back the government for white people from this biracial legislature that they saw as being run really by carpetbaggers from the North. These redeemers use monuments to decorate the State House grounds and to celebrate whites' dominance over Black South Carolinians. These monuments, I argued, use history to celebrate individuals, especially white supremacists like Martin Witherspoon Gary and, of course, Ben Tillman, who oppressed Black people, as a warning to people in the present, Black people in the present, that if you assert your civil rights again, you will be oppressed as you were in Reconstruction, like Gary did, or even after Reconstruction, as Tillman did. So here we see history being used to remind Black people to stay in line, but also to remind white people that even though they lost the Civil War, they won Reconstruction. Neither Black people nor the federal government would have power over them again. Today, I'm going to zero in on the monuments that explicitly have to do with the Civil War, and there are a lot. So these are the monuments that in my research I've determined to being about the Civil War, all those marked in red. And you can consider them in the context of the monuments I presented last time. They are part of this redemption narrative. They're always going to be about both the Civil War and Reconstruction that really shaped not only South Carolina, but this site in particular. But they also have some interesting lessons to teach us about how monuments talk to each other across the landscape. And I use the word landscape really broadly to describe both grass and trees and paths and buildings, but also the relationship between all of those things. Monuments talk to each other. Buildings talk to each other. And in a landscape that is as intentional, like this one at the State House, they talk to each other even more loudly in their intentions, in the intentions that their creators have for them. The monuments I'll talk about today also remind us that while it's important to consider every Confederate monument under the big umbrella of Confederate monuments, to lump them all together, there are certainly things that they have in common. We must also make sure to look at each individually, because each monument has its own history and it deserves to be considered in its own physical and historical context. Because once you start to look closely, you realize that just because a monument might look like one in another place, or even be made by the same artist, or even frankly be exactly the same sculpture, its context geographically and historically give it particular meaning. And that history is something to consider. That meaning is something to consider when determining whether or not you continue to agree with its values. So let's begin in perhaps an unexpected place. And that's the monuments to the Spanish-American War on the State House grounds. The Spanish-American War, not one that I learned about much in history class, but it lasted about 10 weeks over the spring of 1898. It was one of our shortest overseas conflicts. It began when the Uss Maine, a battleship, was blown up in Havana Harbor in Cuba during Cuba's War of Independence from Spain. 379 Americans died, and South Carolina sent fewer than 1,000 soldiers. So our contribution to the Spanish-American War, both as Americans and as South Carolinians, in comparison to other wars like World War II or World War I, is very different. And in fact, South Carolina had a pretty sad contribution to this, a particularly sad contribution to the Spanish-American War. Our National Guard was not up to snuff in 1898. And in fact, over 39% of volunteers for the Spanish-American War from South Carolina were deemed unfit for enlistment. And most of our guys didn't even get to Cuba by the time the war ended. Okay, so all of that. The Spanish-American War is second only to the Civil War as the most memorialized war on the State House grounds. There are 3 monuments built between 1900 and 1942. The first is a cannon captured in Santiago. The cannon was given this magnificent granite base and then scrapped during World War II. And so you can see a picture on the bottom there of the cannon being lifted up by a crane as it was being shipped off to the scrapyard to make bullets for World War II. And all that remains today is this base where it once sat, which I think is a particularly interesting monument. We also have a gun from the Uss Maine, about 15 years after the battle and that began or the blowing up of the USS Maine that began the Spanish-American War, began America's involvement in Cuba's war for independence. The ship was raised from the harbor in a really dramatic way, and little pieces of it were given as relics to cities all over the country, and we got this gun. And then the third monument is the last monument, and that's an idealized American soldier. It's a cast of a sculpture designed by a female artist. Actually, the only work of art on the only monument designed by a female artist on the State House grounds. And you can see this exact same monument in parks across America. So why build so many monuments to a war that we barely contributed to? The easy answer is that all of these monuments are much more about the Civil War than the Spanish-American War. I mean, you can insert a joke here that everywhere you go in South Carolina, no matter what, everything's about the Civil War, even when it's not about the Civil War, right? At each of the dedications for these 3 monuments, even the one in 1941, veterans talked about the Spanish-American War in terms of the Civil War. They draped each of these monuments in both American and Cuban flags, but also Confederate flags. Why? The 1898 Spanish-American War was the first war in which white soldiers from the North and South fought together. It was immediately recognized as a moment of reconciliation for white people, both north and south of the Mason-Dixon line. Many of the men who fought in the Spanish-American War were the sons of veterans. They were seeking glory that they had grown up hearing their grandfathers and their fathers talking about. This print was produced as a souvenir for a national reunion of Confederate veterans held in Memphis in 1901. 15,000 Confederate veterans came. I think this is a great artifact that has a lot to tell us, even about the monuments on the South Carolina State House grounds. All across the top here, you see different Confederate generals, people you'll recognize. Wade Hampton from South Carolina, Stonewall Jackson, the great hero from Virginia. Here in the center is Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a lieutenant general and founder of the Ku Klux Klan. The ball for the event here in 1901 in Memphis was hosted by groups of veterans named after Forrest, so he gets pride of place in this image. In the center are 2 figures you definitely recognize: the Union and Confederate generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, and they're reenacting the truce at Appomattox that ended the war. What I'm interested in is happening to either side of them, right inside this neoclassical arch. On one side, you have a Revolutionary War soldier. On the other side, you have a Spanish-American War soldier. Here, these veterans in 1901 are coming together to celebrate their time on the battlefield, and they're drawing literally a straight line through American history. Like the Revolutionary War soldiers, these Confederate veterans are arguing that they stood up for what they believed in. They stood up for the rights that they believe were guaranteed to them in the Constitution. And then they come back together to the Union to fight for a common cause in the Spanish American War. The drawing of straight lines through the past, connecting these dots that really, in terms of how the past happens, are really messy, part of a huge constellation. That simplification down to these three events: Revolutionary War, Civil War, Spanish American War. This is memory at its best. This is about reimagining the past in a way that is convenient for the present. Where's Reconstruction in here? Where's secession even in here? Any attempt to make right on emancipation, not part of this story. It doesn't serve the narrative. So the Spanish American War is really cast in this light of the Civil War because of this moment of reconciliation, this moment when white Northerners and white Southerners fight alongside one another. The larger narrative in popular American culture that made this reconciliation between white people, North and South, possible is the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause was a national movement in memory that permeated every aspect of American life and is still visible everywhere. It was a version of the past, a memory, not history, that was consciously created and reinforced by white people nationwide. Black people are white people in the North as well as white people in the South, people in California. We see it in museums, movies, textbooks, and most publicly and most controversially now, monuments. The Lost Cause is often called a myth by historians like me because it was a way of looking at the past and specifically looking at the Confederacy and the antebellum period in the South in the best possible light. It promoted ideas that, most importantly, the Confederate States seceded because they were following their interpretation of the Constitution, states' rights, not because of slavery. It promoted the idea that African Americans were happy under slavery. And this kind of playful relationship that we see Scarlett O'Hara have with Mammy, both in the book and movie versions of Gone with the Wind, is probably the best example of that. Mammy chose to stay with the family after Reconstruction during the war because she loved them so much. She loved them more than her own family. They were her family. This is essentially, essential Lost Cause. Also is the argument that the Confederacy lost. It's called the Lost Cause. They're admitting that they lost. The Confederacy lost only because it was an agricultural society. They were outmatched by those sneaky Northerners that always had more guns, that always had more ships, and they always had those big cities. Meanwhile, the Southerners, they were defending their way of life, an aristocratic way of life, based in agriculture, based in beauty and grace. The acknowledgement that the Confederates lost is always based in Lost Cause and this belief that what they were defending was perfect, was idyllic, was timeless, was beautiful, never with any recognition, of course, that it was all based in the brutality of human beings owning other human beings because of their race. This Lost Cause allowed both individual soldiers, these veterans that attended the reunion in Memphis in 1901, but also men like Robert E. Lee to be considered honorable heroes. It allowed them to stand next to men like Ulysses Grant in images moving forward. Monuments and public spaces were the most elaborate investments in the Lost Cause. And today they're the hardest to deal with. They are so complicated because they were so successful. And this is evidenced by the fact that many people look at Confederate monuments as history rather than memory. They believed them, they worked. Monuments, Lost Cause monuments, were incredibly powerful at shaping how people thought about the past as well as the present. And they wrote the Lost Cause into the very fabric, the landscape of American cities and towns, the most dramatic of which is Monument Avenue, a landscape that I grew up with in Virginia. This is literally writing the Lost Cause, the story of the South, onto the landscape. On the steps of courthouses and state houses, lost cause monuments brought that version of the antebellum past, of the Civil War, into the present. They denied that Reconstruction ever happened, or when they did acknowledge it, it was a failed, crazy experiment. Can you imagine giving Black people power? No way. Let's go back to how things were before. After all, people were happy under slavery. These monuments were then activated by new laws that continued to oppress Black people. Arguments that slavery, that people had been fine, that they had been happy under slavery, legitimized continuing arguments for segregation, disenfranchisement, and anti lynching. Standing in front of buildings where laws were made for living people, these monuments were reminders that white people won. Even if they might have lost the Civil War, white Southerners won Reconstruction, and they still had power over Black people. These monuments were then activated even more, made continually present again and again by rituals. And so I show you on this picture this incredible postcard of 1,000 children dressed up and arranged to create a Confederate flag on the State House steps in South Carolina. And they were there to celebrate the dedication of the Robert E. Lee Memorial Highway. And this marker sits right there on Gervais Street, which is part of that network of roads that created this highway. And this is a great example of the lost cause, because in naming all of these roads part of a network after Robert E. Lee, they're inscribing the lost cause on the landscape. But then they're activating it even more by including 1,000 children to recreate one of the images central to the Confederacy, the Confederate flag. By engaging children in this way, the lost causers were making the argument that the lost cause is not in the present. It's going to continue in the minds and in the values of each of the white children creating this flag on the State House steps. Ultimately, the lost cause argued that Southern culture, white supremacy, was inherently good and worth defending, both during the Civil War and against anybody who was going to test it in the future, whether they be white, Black, North, or South. The first lost cause monument on the State House grounds was the South Carolina Monument to the Confederate Dead. And this one I already kind of talked about last time. Like many or most lost cause monuments, it was erected by a women's organization, in this case, the South Carolina Monument Association. Women were a central part of spreading the lost cause gospel, especially via groups like this and monuments like this. They organized events like memorial days that, like that pageant of the Confederate flag, activated monuments in public spaces and regularly reminded them that the past is not something far away, but something that they can draw a straight line through to the present. By celebrating the lives of these soldiers through this version of history, this lost cause, they were able to claim that not much had changed since the Civil War. Now, our Confederate monument is pretty typical of the monuments to Civil War soldiers erected in both the North and the South. And you probably heard that you will see the exact same sculpture on a Southern monument to Confederates as you will see on a Northern monument to Union soldiers. And in some cases, that's 100% true. All of these monuments rest on the idea of the common soldier monument, the common soldier, the kind of one man to stand for the many. And this was attractive to Americans nationwide. In both North and the South, they offered models of idealized citizenship. And this is evidence of the lost cause. It suggests that whether a Confederate or a Union soldier, all of these men were Americans and therefore deserving of reverence. And here's where you can start to imagine that brother against brother narrative you often hear. I always think of the movie North and South, Patrick Swayze. That idea that these two people from the same family can fight against each other and then come back together. This is part of that narrative of reconciliation. And I wanted to promote my friend Thomas Brown's book, This is a fabulous book. He is a professor at USC. In his new book, Civil War Monuments and the Militarization of America, he really tracks the development of this type of monument, which he sees as a particularly American invention of this period. You can see I like this book a lot. I have lots of Post-its. But while the Civil War monument on the State House grounds are certainly about the lost cause, they are also about recasting the memories of Reconstruction, particular to South Carolina, and particular to this site, the South Carolina State House as well. And we see this not so much in the content of the Confederate monument, its statue or its inscription, but in its context, both within the landscape, its geographic location, and its historical context. So this is where I get back to my plea at the beginning that you have to consider each monument individually. The South Carolina Monument Association started in 1869 as a direct response to Reconstruction. They wanted to build a monument to veterans, but they knew that with this biracial legislature that they saw in the hands of their former slaves and carpetbaggers, there's no way that they could have gotten it built on the State House grounds. So their plan was to build it out at Elmwood Cemetery. Well, by the time they actually got the money together, got the statue together, got the base going, the Redeemers had taken back the legislature. 1876, 1877. Wade Hampton is elected as governor as the result of a violent and fraudulent election. So now, with white people back, white Democrats back in the State House, expelling those Republicans who they saw as carpetbaggers, expelling the African Americans elected during Reconstruction, they begin to imagine the State House grounds as a landscape to celebrate that redemption of power. So, the South Carolina Monument Association in 1879 erects this monument across from the or in front of the State House. And at first, and this is one of the only pictures I found where it's actually in its original location. It's right up against the building. And it's unveiled across from the Palmetto Monument, creating this really nice balance across the other side of the building. The portico was not completed yet. There were no steps yet on this north side of the building. So by putting this monument in front of the State House within this a year or two after they had redeemed power with electing Wade Hampton, white South Carolinians made the argument, this is almost like an exclamation point, that they had taken back power. Well, in 1882, the monument was hit with lightning and the statue was decapitated. And there were some really colorful editorials in the paper talking about how, well, those lost causers got what they deserved, but the lost cause is nothing if not determined. And 2 years later, they have a new statue that's pretty similar, and they move the monument out in front of the building. Now, this is a really assertive kind of move, right? It's on axis with the building. It shows a confidence that the previous location lacked. Shortly thereafter, the George Washington Monument was moved into the place formerly first occupied by the Confederate Monument. So now you have this little triad, this triangle of victories that draws a straight line through South Carolina history, all the way from George Washington and the American Revolution through the Confederacy. So this is both a decoration of the landscape and an activation of the landscape. Now monuments are in conversation with each other and with the building, reinforcing the various narratives of sovereignty and white supremacy, and therefore justifying legislative decisions made within this building to disenfranchise Black people, to cut off the rights that they had gained following emancipation and Reconstruction. On the other side of the building, creating a kind of extension of this axis. In 1912, we have the female counterpart to the ideal male citizen. We have the Confederate Mother. This statue was added on the axis of the Confederate man, the ideal Confederate man, in 1912. And again, women were key parts of the lost cause. They were one of the things that Confederate men, like the one on the Confederate Monument, were defending. They were fighting the Civil War to keep their white women from falling victim to Black men, to protect them as they raised more Confederate sons. And women were really the major proponents of the lost cause, especially through groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They built monuments, they opened veterans' homes. They were the ones who got textbooks into the hands of legislatures that some legislatures are only now moving out of classrooms. South Carolina's monument to the Confederate women is one of the nation's earliest, and I would argue that it's one of the nation's strangest. It put forth the idea of this idealized woman. She's up on a pedestal. She's being crowned by this genius of state, this winged, victorious figure. To either side of her is a little girl acting very demure and a little boy being very confident, presenting the kind of gender ideals that the lost cause held. There's a really long inscription on the sides of this monument that I encourage you to read. And actually, it's up on Historic Columbia's website in the online tour. There's pictures of each of these plaques, and you can go through them. But in this, which I will not read to you, inscription, we see a justification. That word justifies the righteous cause of the Confederacy, but it also speaks to Reconstruction, which it calls the resurrection of truth and glorious vindication of redemption. So again, we have those dual narratives of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, two things happened at the turn of the century that really energized South Carolinians to organize their state house grounds around these memories of the lost cause and Reconstruction. The first is the completion of the building. Now, the South Carolina State House grounds was a construction site for more than 50 years. We're talking stuff everywhere. This thing was not completed. And in fact, even once the dome was put on, many declared the building still incomplete. They still wanted the tower that had originally been imagined. The architect that they hired at the end of the century, they did like everything else the legislature did in the early 20th century, which is they did it on the cheap. And Frank Milburn argued that the tall stone tower that had originally been imagined by Frank Yancey was just too expensive. And so he did this shorter, squatter dome. Once this building is completed, the dome, the porticos are finished, it's outfitted on the interiors, people start looking around at this huge 20-acre site and say, wait a second, this is a dump. We've got to do something about it. Where's that handsome park that we had imagined when we started building this building in the 1850s? At around the same time, South Carolina's greatest lost cause hero, Wade Hampton, dies. And it's these two things that really kick off the lost cause on the State House grounds. Hampton was the son of the richest antebellum planter family in South Carolina. He was a Confederate general and, of course, the first Democratic governor elected after the Civil War. His election in 1876, again, ended Reconstruction. After his death in 1902, the state responded by appropriating $20,000 for an equestrian monument. They were specific. They wanted an equestrian monument. And this monument was finally built in 1906. Unlike the soldier monuments, which are a really new thing that happened in America after the Civil War, equestrian monuments have a really, really long history and tie to ancient Rome, especially in ancient Greece. And here's the famous Marcus Aurelius in Rome. A bronze sculpture of Wade Hampton put him in this category of this timeless, powerful man. Up on a high pedestal, sitting on a horse, he was powerful forever, even in death. Monuments like Hampton's were often surrounded by cannons, weapons of the very wars that they fought. These monuments, as a collection, were warnings that should there ever be another battle, these guys are ready. But it wasn't just about the battle of the Civil War. It was also about the battles of Reconstruction. A senator on the House of the Senate floor in South Carolina making an argument for this gigantic $20,000 appropriation for Wade Hampton made this argument in his speech. I'm going to read this. While others failed, and the case in which they fought ultimately was lost, his sword, Hampton's sword, flashed only in the sunlight of success. And when the war was over and his state was in the grasp of the conqueror, whose hatred could be appeased only by her degradation, and she was given over to pillage and sack by the vulgarest band of freebooters that ever preyed upon a prostrate state, and after 8 long and humiliating years, his people rose in their might and resolved to throw off the loathsome domination and look for a leader worthy of the great work they were about to undertake. All eyes with one accord turned to him, and one of the greatest revolutions that ever shed luster on the Anglo-Saxon race, they prevailed. What this guy is talking about here to justify this statue is not Civil War. He's talking about Reconstruction. So this monument is about Hampton's 2 victories. 1, a valiant effort in the Civil War. This is all filtered through the lost cause. And 2, taking the state government back from the biracial Reconstruction era legislature. And in fact, this is baked into the monument itself. So the body here is Hampton in his Confederate uniform, but the head is Hampton as senator. This was explicit. Frederick Wellington Ruxtell, the artist here who made this statue in France, he came to Columbia to much acclaim. He was very much a local celebrity. And he took photographs and did sketches of Hampton's sword, of his hat, of his uniform. But then he also took photographs like this one, shot by Matthew Brady, when Hampton was a senator in Washington. And he was explicit about how this statue put these 2 Hamptons together, that it represented Hampton at 2 different points, 20 years apart in his life, again, drawing that straight line through history. These intertwined narratives of both the lost cause and Reconstruction were then written onto the landscape. Wade Hampton's statue was originally located on axis with the front of Trinity Cathedral because he is buried in its churchyard. It's moved in 1969. We'll talk about that next time. In 1913, another monument is added on the same axis, this time to the Revolutionary War. Again, we're drawing this straight line on the landscape backwards from the Reconstruction to the Civil War, all the way back to the Revolutionary War. In 1940, the addition of the Benjamin Tillman Monument along the same line, same axis, takes us even further into the 20th century. Tillman was praised for his work as governor and as senator after Reconstruction. He finally legislated what the lost causers, what the redeemers had been working for years through violence and intimidation of Black voters. He finally legislated Black people out of the electoral process. And this is all written on the landscape. In the 1930s, state historian Alexander Sally, who was a leading member of Columbia's Lost Cause organizations, he was historian for United Confederate Veterans, he made the State House itself into a Civil War monument. He placed stars on the exterior of the building, as well as a series of plaques explaining them, to mark the damage the building sustained during the siege on Columbia by Union forces in February 1865. In the first version of these plaques, they were first bronze, and then somebody tried to pry them off the building, probably because they were hungry, and he replaced them with stone ones. But in the first version of the plaques, he called these stars markers of honorable scars. That terminology, honorable scars, is really specific. And anybody in the 1930s, especially over a certain age, would have recognized that that was the same language that veterans of the Civil War used to describe their injuries that they sustained during the war, their lost arms, their lost legs, their lost eyes. That's the terminology, honorable scar. Again, so tied with the lost cause. So rather than fixing these damaged balusters, rather than fixing this damaged granite, he highlights it. He leaves it alone and highlights it. He also added the plaque to the base of the Washington sculpture, essentially saying forever that the Yankees did it. This broken cane, the Yankees did it, y'all. He also built a tombstone to the first state house, which I think is just almost funny, especially since it's moved, so it doesn't actually mark where the state house had been before. But all of this together, this pointing out the damage done by Union forces, done by Union aggression, done by Union soldiers who were so uncouth that they broke the cane of the Washington statue. This was part of the lost cause. This all played into the lost cause. This argument that South Carolinians, when they fought in the Civil War, were merely standing up for their constitutional rights. And the feds, those Union troops, were barbaric, burning buildings, breaking George Washington. So there's this funny thing in the lost cause where Southerners are victims. But they're also, of course, through Reconstruction, they're always victors as well. On the other side of this violence inflicted upon this building, this statue, is the redemption of Reconstruction. They come back, they took back this building. They're able to erect these monuments. These are all a testament to that second victory. And these are warnings that what happens when Southerners are attacked is that they will fight back and that they will win and that ultimately they will always be right. Also in the 1930s, the Confederate flag is flown in the State House for the first time. The Confederate flag is first flown in the House chamber in 1938 and then in the Senate chamber in 1956. Not until 1962 does it go up on the dome where it will sit until the end of the century. We'll pick up with this last time, but something to leave you with, that once again, we'll see that symbols of the past are used or organized or simplified to be made useful to create an easy timeline back through time. From the present to the past, symbols like this are essentially political tools that people use in order to argue their political points in the present. So as the defenders of the lost cause become even more intent in the 1950s and 1960s on using these symbols when rising Black power threatens their Southern way of life, segregation and white supremacy with civil rights. And we'll pick up there in the 1950s and 60s next time. I'm glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Lydia. Once again, an excellent presentation that's incredibly enlightening for all of us. If folks have questions, if you would send them in the chat box, I will review those and send them on to Lydia. And while you are working through that, I do want to remind you that this is a project that was supported in part by the Richland County Conservation Commission, who supported Lydia's original research, and then also the South Carolina Humanities, who provided a grant to Historic Columbia to continue to work with Lydia so that we could put together the web-based tour and the guided tours of the State House grounds. So certainly want to be sure that the Richland County Conservation Commission and South Carolina Humanities are highlighted. And then we also, as Lydia has referred to a number of times, have the third part of this series on August the 18th, and it will be via Zoom. If you'd like to sign up for that, you can register at the link below. And we will also be sending out a link to everybody who participated in this presentation today.
I realized I didn't put the date on the slide. That wasn't a very good idea. August 18th, also a Tuesday.
So Lydia, I do not have any questions at this point.
No questions
or comments?
I'll tell a story about the broken cane here in Alexander Sally while you come up with something to get me with. Sally tried to fix the cane in 1909 and it broke off and then he gave up. So there was a moment where he tried. And one of the explanations for the broken cane that was floated in the years right after Reconstruction in the 1880s and 1890s, and then as far as I can tell, disappeared. I didn't find it again in the 20th century, is that the cane was broken as two African American legislators during Reconstruction were fighting and they fell into the cane and broke it. And that story really kind of tops the Yankees did it version in the decades right after Reconstruction. And I see that as a very convenient, again, use of history, connecting this object of the past with what's happening in the present. And of course, this story would have been used or was used as an argument for why Black people were unfit for political power, that they're going to fight and fall into the Washington statue. How could they possibly represent white people in the legislature? But then that story disappears once the lost cause really takes hold at the beginning of the 20th century and then is ultimately enshrined with this plaque in 1938.
All right. Now we're heating up.
All right.
Who was the figure who placed the stars on the State House, just as a follow-up?
Yeah. So Alexander Sally was the first state historian, and I think Chuck is on this list somewhere. Who has written a great book. Chuck Lesser has written a great book on the history of the state archives, and that is available on the state archives website. I think it's called 50 Years. But it talks about Sally and how he really fought to get South Carolina's records and South Carolina's official history protected, documented, and written during his time as the state historian. And he really took a hold of the State House grounds in a way in the 1930s, helping to guide legislators who wanted to put new monuments up, who wanted to commemorate different things. He was really in charge of it. And I think his vision and his lost cause narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction was really what dominated that period.
Was there a debate among politicians and the public about where to move these monuments around the State House grounds, or was there largely consensus that they merited these prominent places and should create these lines of historical continuity?
Sorry, I'm trying to move you so I can at least pretend like I'm looking at you when you talk to me. It's just a really strange thing. I still haven't gotten used to it. So there really wasn't that much discussion. For the most part, there really weren't that many legislators that were interested in the monuments. It was always really a handful of people that felt really strongly about it. And often the people who were loudest were coming from outside the legislature. So in the case of the Women's Monument, here's a good example. Let me get back to a picture of it so you can remember what she looks like. The Women's Monument is erected in 1912 on the south steps of the State House, and it has this little enclosure around it. And people really didn't talk that much about it. I think somebody probably just said, well, it makes sense we don't have anything on the south side of the building, and it's in line there with the Confederate Men Monument. That makes sense. So they just stuck it there. But then that was in 1912, where there really wasn't much traffic on Senate Street, which at that time was completely open to traffic. So they put this flimsy little railing around it, and people kept driving into it. And so in the late 1920s and early 1930s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, to who this monument was really dedicated, said, hey guys, this is really unseemly. The monument's being damaged. And so they argued for it to be moved to the northeast corner of the State House grounds, where the Jimmy Burns Monument is now. And so it sat there until 1972, when the Jimmy Burns Monument was put in its place, and then it was kicked back to the south end of the State House grounds. So sometimes there was debate, but usually it was, if somebody made a good argument for it, most people said, well, whatever, you care more than I do, and allowed it to go up.
What monument did you find had the strangest or most surprising connection to the Civil War, and why?
Oh, that's a good question. I think probably the Partisan Generals Monument. This is a monument that, frankly, I did not even notice after I had been studying this site for a month or two, and then I was like, "Oh yeah, there's that column over there on Sumter Street." And this monument's a great monument. There are these, and I mean that artistically. There's these kind of sad profiles of the different. Can't see them here, but these kind of sad profiles of the different Revolutionary War um, militia generals on the base, and they're kind of bad in part because the artist didn't have pictures of all of them. He didn't know what they looked like, so he was kind of making them up. And this monument, I think there's nothing about it other than its location on the landscape that really makes it physically part of the Civil War lost cause narrative. And even that I didn't see for a long time, not until I figured out where the Hampton Monument had been before. That's really the only point where that made sense. But it was in reading the dedications of this monument that I really understood that this was about the Civil War as much as it was about the Revolutionary War. The descriptions of Sumter and Marion and Pickens, these Revolutionary War militia leaders, fighting this battle in the swamps during Revolution, the American Revolution, were really metaphorical and very clearly about a similar kind of battle as during Reconstruction. Pushing back against the British was very much like pushing back against the federal government during Reconstruction. And so that's the reading the dedications that were really passionate about a monument that, frankly, I hadn't really noticed. Really convinced me that this was about the Civil War, and also convinced me that I need to give every monument its due, even when I don't particularly think it's attractive.
It's the art historian coming out.
Buried in there somewhere.
So this is our last question, Lydia, from one of your colleagues. Where do you stand on where Confederate monuments should end up?
Well, that's assuming that I think they should all come down.
More contextual information added, museums, statuary, graveyard were this person's questions.
Yeah, that's a good list, and I think they should all be options. And this gets back to kind of where I started. I think every monument needs to be considered on its own merit. And as I've shown, so many of these are really interconnected. And so you can start to form kind of groups or pods or clusters that you might want to consider together. I think you have to consider both the historical significance and the aesthetic significance of some of these monuments. So a monument like Hampton's, the Trinity Cathedral members are really going to hate me for this, but putting this in a place like his grave, or in front of the Hampton Preston Mansion, Robin, you guys want it? That that would be a really appropriate place to recontextualize this monument, which is significant. This is the first. And I think one of the only, if not the only, somebody please correct me, equestrian monument in South Carolina, which does make it a significant historical artifact in its own right. Aesthetically, it's really similar to other monuments that Frederick Wellington Ruxtol designed. In fact, he did a monument to a Union general named Hartencraft that's at the Pennsylvania State House that my husband and I visited last year, and it is the spitting image of this same horse. So this one's not particularly unique aesthetically, but I think it is really significant historically. And also this kind of dual Hampton that it embodies, I think is really important to understanding Hampton's significance in the lost cause. And this is the best artifact to teach that with, that he has this, Hampton of the 1880s head and Hampton of the 1860s body. If you destroy that, if you melt that down, that lesson's going to be harder to teach. Other monuments, I think, are appropriate for museums because they are historical artifacts in themselves. And a great example of that would be the George Washington statue. There's only 5 of these copies of the 18th century sculpture by Jean-Antoine Houdin that's in the Virginia State Capitol, only five copies were made in the 19th century. So I would argue that if the populace agrees that the statute doesn't no longer represents values that we're interested in, and I think there absolutely is an argument to be made that this is both a Civil War monument and a monument to slavery, then I would hope that this would be a monument that could find a home where it is preserved as an artifact, as a historical artifact, because it is so rare. Other monuments are much more mundane and could be pieced apart, or could be preserved in pieces. So the Confederate Monument might be an example of that. And of course, recontextualizing any of these with interpretation on site is always an option that should be considered. And one of the things that I think is a really interesting challenge for a place like the South Carolina State House grounds that has so many monuments, we have a lot more than a lot of other state house grounds, from what I've been able to figure out. And these interconnected relationships, these kind of moving targets, as and if monuments continue to be moved, I think there is an opportunity to mark that on the landscape. Erasing the monument completely doesn't have to be the only option. The one option that I really personally think is very problematic is taking all the Confederate monuments and putting them in one place. And I know that has been a discussion in New Orleans with the monuments that were removed a couple of years ago. Different people have stepped forward and said that they'll buy them, that they'll take them off the state's hands because they're still or the city's hands. They're still in an undisclosed location in New Orleans. But the city, and I think rightly so, is scared to do that because wherever those monuments go, so could violence and white supremacists that want to attract people to them because they want to continue this through line of history. And I think clustering them together like that is potentially really dangerous. So those are all the options, which I think should be considered for every monument. It's complicated. Taking these down would be a lot harder than putting them up. And that's because our power structure looks so different now. When these monuments were erected, one group had unquestionable power. And that is absolutely not true anymore. And so the process of removing them is going to be a lot more complicated. And that's the way it should be. That shows that we're a democracy.
Thank you, Lydia. And I guess we'll talk about some of those potential processes on the 18th.
Yeah, we'll talk about all these monuments moving. It's really fun to watch them move.
Well, thank you again for being with us today, and we look forward to having you back on the 18th. And thanks everybody for participating in the conversation and the presentation today. I hope that you'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, and thanks to those of you who kept your cameras on. It's really disconcerting to give a lecture without anybody to talk to. And I love talking to myself, but I'd much rather talk to some friendly faces. So I appreciate those of you who are brave enough to leave your cameras on. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Take care.